One of the things that I've learned by looking at the Dritsila tradition is that there is more to the tradition than simply a body of story. What there is a whole disciplined understanding of story and of the world that goes along with the stories and is expressed through them. And I think it can be easy when you start looking at stories and storytelling from the outside to think that when you go to tradition, to oral tradition, there is nothing in tradition but the stories. And so what you have to do is take the story and provide a framework of understanding that tradition doesn't give you. And that's the attraction of looking to writers like Young or Campbell, because the temptation is to think that they provide a kind of explicit explanation of the stories that the tradition doesn't provide. And actually, I think often that is a mistake. It's that the tradition does in fact provide its own explanations. It is itself a disciplined framework of commentary on the stories that it holds. And I think a lot of the time the understandings that tradition bearers and tradition-bearing communities have of the stories that they tell are actually a lot more extensive, a lot more consciously developed, a lot more, if you want to say, put it this way, intellectually substantive than they've often been given credit for. So if you take the story out of its context and go, plonk, right, what should we do with this one? Oh, Young, Campbell. That's fine, you can get a viable interpretation, but back in its original context it had another interpretation as well, and very often that's the one that I think will be probably the more informative in a particular case. It's just a complicated way of thinking. I think that traditions themselves are a lot smarter than sometimes we give them credit for, I think, when we come and look at them from the point of view of outsiders. My training was as an academic folklorist, and through that I was introduced to the work of scholars going back many decades in academic folklore, from scholars like Richard Dawson, Dennis Tedlock, and Del Hymes, and what they were doing back in the 1970s and 80s, and Charles Briggs and people like that, was they were becoming more aware of the fact that in order to understand a story you had to see it as best you could in its original context, and that meant in its original physical context, the context of the community who was telling it, and what you might call the cognitive context in which it was told. That would not be seen as an original idea among academic folklorists. It's standard operational procedure, as I understand it, but there are many other disciplines, particularly in practical storytelling, where it's not necessarily taken for granted. And so, I review books. I did a small storytelling magazine, and I review books where, and also I review books of digital storytelling and many of the other other disciplines of storytelling, where they'll just go, oh yeah, they'll have one footnote to Joseph Campbell, and they'll assume or write as if they've explained the whole thing when they haven't.